Hello, I'm Ashley Hicks. I'm an interior designer. I've been fascinated by the interiors of Buckingham Palace since I was a child. And the most exciting rooms of all, to my mind, are the Chinese-inspired ones in the East Wing, which are very little known, and I was privileged to be allowed to photograph them. So I'm going to show you pictures of them today. First off, we're going to start downstairs in the ambassador's entrance, which you see in pink on the left of the plan here. And then we're going to move through to what were built by George IV as his libraries, 3 rooms at the top of the plan facing onto the garden. They then were never used as libraries because he died before he moved in. And so King William IV transferred the whole of the Royal Library to Windsor Castle, whereupon these rooms were left unfinished until Queen Victoria arrived. Then we'll go upstairs, in the great excitement of the whole thing, to see the East Wing and the rooms with the heavy Chinese influence added by Queen Victoria. So here is the outside of the ambassador's entrance. This is porte cochere, was formed in 1924 using the old little pedimented portico that had originally been done by Nash and then altered by Bloor. But this was a new entrance so that ambassadors could drive under the porte cochere and not get wet before presenting their credentials. Moving inside, here you can see the open doors out to the porte cochere and then steps up. On the mirror over the fireplace is this rather wonderful confection of silvered carved wood with a garter star holding a clock hanging from a sort of festoon of flowers and drapery, rather like a 1920s updated version of Grinling Gibbons, and above it a marvellous cipher for King George and Queen Mary. And the jardiniere in front was a Chinese one of about 1750, bought by the Prince Regent and mounted by Pavillion, and you see that the mounts match the ones in the Grand Hall of the palace, and that's because they were all made as a set to furnish the banqueting room in Brighton. There's a short corridor going from the ambassador's entrance towards the body of the palace in the quadrangle, and there's hanging a number of royal portraits, including on the left this unfinished copy by Hayter's studio of his state portrait of Queen Victoria. And this unfinished work has a rather modern look to it, and it was bought by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in 1949. And I think she probably rather liked the rather contemporary edge to the picture, and she was a great collector of contemporary art at the time, and commissioned John Piper to record Windsor Castle during the war in a series of marvellous watercolours. On the right, on the table, you see a sculpture by a South African artist who is of Shona descent. His name is Caspar Darare, and this was a gift from Robert Mugabe to the Queen in 1991 during a state visit. Now here we are in the Bow Room. So this is the central of those 3 rooms built by George IV as libraries. They were supposed to open off his bedroom, rather in the way that his father, George III, had constructed those 3 enormous book rooms in Buckingham House, opening from his bedroom. But this room was not furnished until Queen Victoria's time. And here in this photograph of 1873, we can see it looking marvellously Victorian, and with this enormous Sèvres vase. It's one of the biggest pieces of Sèvres ever made. Here it is in pictures from the Royal Collection's website, because it's no longer in the room. And this was the centerpiece of the Sèvres stand at the Paris exhibition of 1855, which had been slightly prompted, of course, by the London exhibition of 1851, the Great Exhibition, organised by Prince Albert. And so at the 1855 exhibition in Paris, Napoleon III was very happy to take Prince Albert to the Sèvres stand and explain to him that this had been made as a gift to him in commemoration of the exhibition in London. And here's one of the side bays of the Bow Room, And here you can see how there used to be internal curved windows which got daylight from external windows beyond, and they were blocked up at some point and turned into vitrines for this collection of porcelain, which has slightly darkened the room. The whole decorative scheme of the room was fixed by Queen Victoria in the 1850s, following the christening of her youngest son, Prince Leopold, and she had a great collection of her family come over to London for the christening, some of them godparents, some of them not, and had Wildhauser make portraits of them and of the baby Leopold. And here you can see Leopold in his cot in the bottom portrait, and then above is one of his godfathers, Ernst Hohenlohe-Langenburg, who was married to Queen Victoria's half-sister, Feodora. On the right, you can see an 1873 photograph showing the original plasterwork around the pictures, which was rather fascinating, sort of grotesques in plasterwork, probably designed by Professor Gruner for Prince Albert. Those sadly were swept away under Edward VII and replaced with these gilded wreaths around them. That happened in 1902, and at the same time, the scagliola, which looks so good in the photograph on the right, especially with all of the white-painted architectural detail, the capitals of the columns and the cornice, etc., was all altered, and as you can see on the left, the result is not quite so happy. Stacked up in the background of the picture are some of the dining chairs from the banqueting room in Brighton, which are used throughout the palace today still. On the right here, you can see another of Winterhalter's portraits, this one of Augusta, the Princess of Prussia, who would become the first German empress and was the mother of Fritz, who would marry Victoria, the Princess Royal, 5 years after this. Here's a view of the other side of the room, and here you can see the matching vitrines, the one on the left replacing those internal windows, but all of them are filled with this wonderful set of Chelsea porcelain that had been commissioned by Queen Charlotte in 1763 to give to her brother, the Duke of Mecklenburg. The Duke of Mecklenburg was the grandfather of Fritz Mecklenburg, who is the top portrait on the left in this room. And Fritz Mecklenburg was Albert's very dear friend. And the right-hand pair of portraits instead is of the Duke of Cambridge and his sister, Princess Mary Adelaide, the mother of Queen Mary. And Queen Mary had been rather chosen by Queen Victoria as the wife for her grandson. And Queen Mary indeed took a great interest in this room, and she replaced the original fireplaces of the room, which were rather ordinary ones, with what you see here on the left, one of the pair of fireplaces, and these are in black basalt with mounts by Vuillamy, who did so much work for George IV here. And these have been made for Lord Bridgewater's house in Grosvenor Square. And these came up for sale, and Queen Mary thought they were just the thing for this room and for this very Regency house. And on top are Verde Antico vases. Now going next door into what's called the 1844 room to commemorate the visit of the Emperor of Russia in that year. But here on the end wall we can see portraits painted by Richard Brompton for Queen Charlotte of her eldest sons, so George IV on the left as Prince of Wales wearing garter robes, and on the right his brother Fred as Prince Bishop of Osnabrück, and see he's got a bishop's mitre on the top of the frame, and he was appointed Prince Bishop of Osnabrück at the age of 6 months, and here he's wearing the robes of the Order of the Bath. This is how the 1844 room looked very soon after it was decorated. And doesn't it look marvellous? Those scagliola columns, that patterned carpet. It's really rather wonderful. And the arrangement of the portraits is so good, isn't it? The large standing one on the right is particularly splendid, and this is a copy painted for the room by William Corden of a portrait that Tsar Nicholas I of Russia had sent to the Queen after his state visit of 1844. And the original portrait is by Franz Krüger, and it's absolutely enormous. And it was rolled up in the 1930s and put away. And recently it's been unrolled and it was exhibited in the Queen's Gallery with other Russian things quite recently. And Queen Victoria wrote in her diary about how very splendid the Tsar looked wearing his Chevalier de Garde uniform. And here, in fact, he's dressed as a British general instead, and he's wearing the Order of the Garter. But on the left is his sort of ADC or somebody dressed in the Chevalier de Garde uniform. So you can see how splendid that is. But Queen Victoria seems to have found the portrait so good that she did have it copied for this room, which seems slightly curious from today's perspective, given the rather marked interruption to the line of the Tsar's riding breeches, if you see what I mean. Here's the date of the room in plasterwork on the ceiling, and here the fireplace, which has a clock on it bought by Lord Hertford in Paris and given by his illegitimate son, Sir Richard Wallace, who founded the Wallace collection. But this clock was given by Wallace to Colonel Gurwood, who had been a hero of the Napoleonic Wars and went on to be Wellington's secretary and had the thankless task of completing Wellington's memoirs, which drove him so absolutely demented that he killed himself on Christmas Day. Now here's again that portrait of little George, Prince of Wales, and you can see he's got a full suit of armour next to him. He was obviously being seen as having a great military future by Queen Charlotte, and of course he never really abandoned those military pretensions. On the right is the fantastic David Roentgen desk, bought in 1820 by Benoit in Paris, Benoit being King's pastry chef, who would frequently be sent to Paris from shopping expeditions and come back with treasures like this. And David Roentgen was famous throughout Europe for his mechanical furniture. And this does absolutely extraordinary things, this desk. And on the Royal Collection website, there's a marvellous video of it springing open at the touch of a button. Above the desk is a picture that was one of George IV's favourite possessions. This is by Cuyp, Dutch artist, and there's a trooper with his horse. And of course, it's probably a great favourite with the Queen, who does love horses. And on the desk are a pair of binoculars sculpted in bronze and given to Her Majesty the Queen for a lifetime's contribution to the sport of horse racing. Now, the third room, these old libraries, was the 1855 room, and that's celebrating the visit in that year of Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, and his Empress Eugénie. And here is Eugénie and her portrait, which is a copy by an artist called Mary Curtis from a Winterhalter original. And the Winterhalter, which was normally in Paris, was brought over to London for a great ball given at the French embassy in 1855. So I think Queen Victoria probably saw it and said, "Oh, that's wonderful. May I have my artist Mary Curtis take a copy of it?" Which is a rather nice idea. And so the copy was set into the walls of the 1855 room along with its pair of Napoleon III on the other side of the fireplace. Now the room today has exactly the same arrangement of pictures set into the walls with these gilt frames flush with the wall, which is a rather marvellous decorative technique used quite a lot by Robert Adam previously. But Queen Victoria clearly felt that she needed a souvenir album on a rather large scale, and so used these rooms for that purpose, really. And so here we have three portraits by Winterhalter, all taken in 1854. Philippe of Flanders, who was the younger son of her uncle Leopold, and then we've got two Portuguese princes. We've got Pedro, the King of Portugal, who was about 24 when he died, and his brother, also painted here, Luis, the Duke of Porto. He succeeded him. And the seascape is a naval review at Spithead in April 1856, with 250 ships of the Royal Navy reviewed in line by the Queen
who wrote in her diary that without undue boasting I may claim to be Queen of the Seas. Set into the carpet is this rather extraordinary carpet, of which you can see the central feature on the right, Queen's cipher, as she was now Queen Empress of India, and so she has VRI for Victoria Regina Imperatrix, surrounded by the Order of the Garter. And this carpet was subscribed for by the ladies of England, presumably all of them, I'm not sure how that worked, and made by Southwells of Shropshire to commemorate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. And the clock on the fireplace in the room shows Dawn lifting her veil. That was made in 1810 by a clockmaker named Ravrio in Paris. And on the right, a couple of paintings by Queen Victoria's bed artist, George Houseman Thomas. And these show at the top the Queen making Napoleon III a Knight of the Garter in April 1855. And then below, the scene on Horse Guards in London with the Queen distributing medals for the Crimean War. And these again are set into the walls of the room. And here is another of these wonderful pictures. And this shows a military review on the Champ de Mars in Paris, because they, after Napoleon III and Eugénie visited London, the Queen and Prince Albert returned the visit. And you can just see the Queen with her little bonnet sitting on the balcony there. Now here is the East Wing. And we talked about this in the first programme. This was the wing that was added by a rather terrible architect called Edward Blore in 1848, when Queen Victoria had told the Prime Minister that our little family, which is fast growing up, had outgrown the palace and needed more room. And here's a wonderful photograph of it when it's quite new, taken by Roger Fenton in 1858. Now here are the rooms that were prepared for the visit of Napoleon III and Eugénie in 1855 in the then rather new East Wing. So here is the bedroom arranged for Empress Eugénie. Here's the bedroom for Napoleon III. And on the fireplace, you can just see the famous Sèvres vaisseau à main, the potpourri holder that had belonged to Madame de Pompadour. And that's clearly been put there as a nice gesture and something of a talking point when the Queen was showing the Emperor his room. But here is the real point of these pictures, these watercolours commemorating that visit, is the sitting room that was arranged for them. This has been known ever since as the Yellow Drawing Room because of the yellow silk that was newly hung on the walls and used to cover these sofas here for the visit of Napoleon and Eugénie. All of the rest of the decoration of the room had been arranged by Prince Albert when the new East Wing was built, and he made Blore, the architect, include all of the fireplaces from the Brighton Pavilion, which had been sold the year before, partly in order to finance the construction of this new wing. All of the Chinese elements in the room, of course, came from the pavilion. So all of these pagodas and the extraordinary fireplace, which has Chinese vases adapted into a candelabra on top. Here on the left, you can see one of those pagodas topped with ornaments that were actually made by Vuillamy. And the curtain pole that you can see in that left-hand photograph is also rather interesting. That comes from the woodwork of the Saloon in the Brighton Pavilion. And we'll see more of that woodwork reused later on. How long the walls of yellow silk lasted, I don't know. But certainly Queen Mary thought that it was much more appropriate to have this Chinese wallpaper in the room. And this was partly because the wallpaper, which she found rolled up in the attic of Buckingham Palace, had actually come originally from the Brighton Pavilion, part of the 1816 decoration of the Saloon, and had then been taken down in 1824 when the new King, George IV, had got tired of his old decoration of the room. And after all, it had been there for 8 years. It was time for a change. But this wallpaper then was hung here And Queen Mary's decorator, Sir Charles Allen, then helped raise the height of it by adding this sort of scalloped border at the top. Here is the Saloon in Brighton with that wallpaper in 1816. And isn't that a fantastic room? I just absolutely adore that room. Those yellow curtains and the birds everywhere, and it's marvellous. And I think probably when the Prince Regent became king on the death of his father in 1820, he probably felt that this sort of decoration was a little too frivolous, didn't really imply the true gravitas of his new situation. And so he turned to something slightly more regal looking, perhaps, still rather eccentric, it must be said. And all of this was designed by his new man, Robert Jones, who did all this work at the Pavilion. But here in this picture, the main interest is the fireplace on the right, which is this extraordinary confection, which you see here today in the yellow drawing room. And this is white marble and gilt bronze. And the bronze work was done not by Vulliamy, who had done everything normally, and Vulliamy bid £1,500 to produce this fireplace, whereas a new man called Samuel Parker underbid him and bid £840. So it did make everybody slightly wonder exactly how much Vulliamy had been overcharging before. Parker, as well as doing all this gilt bronze work, and indeed painted bronze figures of Chinese court personalities set into the fireplace in those niches below. He provided new gilt bronze work for the clock. It was an 18th century French confection, probably made about 1750 in Paris. Parker was made to add these sunflowers above in order to give it a bit more scale. Here's a detail of the gilt bronze work on the fireplace. Wonderful, vigorous sunflower in the middle, and these extraordinary dragon, snake, I don't know what they are, things writhing around. These bronze lotus flowers, are they? And here's one of these Chinese figures set into niches on the fireplace. And just every detail is, I think, so absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? What about the dragon climbing up that steel pole on the right? And those snarl at each other across the flames of the fire. And then above, those candelabra made from pairs of Chinese export enamelled vases turned top to toe, and with again these Chinese characters standing. This one seems to be standing on a shell that's set onto a sunflower that is sitting on rippling water that's actually done in enamel on brass, and then holding a pair of dolphins. It's a really extraordinary, fantastic creation. And on the right, one of the dragons fixed to the porcelain vase to hold the candles. On the left here, one of the old Chinese porcelain lions turned into the supporters of this clock in Paris in 1750. He's munching on some gilt bronze leaves. And then on the right, one of a pair of armchairs from the music room at the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, made by Bailey and Saunders in 1817. And look at that extraordinary detail on there with sort of bat's wings or dragon wings, are they? Then here is the corridor in the Royal Pavilion. And this is from the great book of views of the Royal Pavilion, commissioned by John Nash to celebrate his great work for the Prince Regent. And you can see lined up on the left there this collection of Indian engraved ivory chairs that were made in about 1760 in India. And then they were bought by King George III in 1781, when he was driving along the road near Marlow and passed a house sale being organised by James Christie, the auctioneer. And so the king stopped his carriage and asked Christie what he was selling. Did he have anything interesting? And so Christie brought these chairs out onto the lawn of the house so the king could have a look at them, whereupon he immediately snapped them up and gave them to Queen Charlotte to decorate the Queen's house, which of course became Buckingham Palace. When Queen Charlotte died, all of her furnishings were sold in an auction at Buckingham House. And these chairs were bought by the Prince Regent and put in the corridor at Brighton. And so it's rather nice that they now stand along the side of the principal corridor, as it's known, in Buckingham Palace, which runs along the east side of the quadrangle. And so all those windows on the left look onto the quadrangle. And then there are a whole line of rooms originally intended for Queen Victoria's daughters. And so this was known when it was built as the Princess's Corridor, since it's become known as the Principal Corridor, because it's on the principal floor. But there on the left is a detail of one of those fantastic Indian engraved ivory chairs. And isn't that incredible? I particularly like the dash of red in the mouths of the rather frightening creatures. Here's another of the chairs with this extraordinary table made by Adam Weisweiler in Paris in ebony veneer and with gilded and painted bronze. There's Chinese figures with their wonderful long moustaches and crossed arms. There's a painted bronze. And this was made in Paris and then sold by Dominique Daguerre, the Marchand Mercier, to the Prince of Wales in about 1787 to decorate his new Chinese drawing room on the basement story of Carlton House, the great house that he was building. And so here is that Chinese drawing room, published in 1793 in Thomas Sheraton, the great furniture makers, cabinet makers and upholsterers' drawing book. And so this was a great style Bible of the time. And so 1793, this is showing the drawing room arranged just really quite newly then. On the right, you can see some working drawings from Henry Holland's office of details for the room, with bells hanging from these fretwork brackets at the top of the little colonnette. You can just see them around the room. And in the engraving from Sheraton's book, you can see that table with its Chinese figures supporting it on the left under the mirror, and then on the right a matching fireplace, which is now in something called the King's Waiting Room in Buckingham Palace. But then on the facing window wall in the Chinese drawing room in Carlton House was this wonderful cabinet, made also by Weisweiler. And here you can see a dragon holding a gilt bronze curtain, held itself by a curved bit of bamboo. And then there's a peacock striding along in the frieze, and little tiny bells, which of course answer to the bells in Holland's interior. Both the table and this cabinet were made into pairs in 1819 by Edward Bailey, so that the then Prince Regent could have pairs of them for his North Drawing Room in Brighton. And then also from Brighton comes this curtain pole. Not quite sure where that one comes from, but isn't it wonderful? And those dragons and those two colours of gilding. And then that curious thing with a sunflower and then it's a sort of an olive wreath that turns into a snake. It's a very strange object, but that was part of the decoration of the Saloon at Brighton. And all of the woodwork from there was reused in the palace, or a great deal of it. There is that curtain pole on the left, and then this rather beautiful pagoda, which is a Chinese export thing, then fitted up with gilt bronze finials in London. It had been bought in Paris in 1815, immediately after the Battle of Waterloo, by Mr. Benoit, the pastry chef, for the music room at Brighton. And then it's sitting on a dragon-legged gilded table from the rose satin drawing room at Carlton House. Now here is this whole suite of chairs that were made for that Chinese drawing room in Carlton House in 1790 by a man called François Hervé, who had a workshop and showroom off the Tottenham Court Road in London, French émigré chairmaker. And these chairs are absolutely extraordinary. They have pierced wooden frames that give them an incredible lightness. And you can just on the right, you can see the light coming through the sort of grille frame. And then in this one on the left here, do you see those arm supports are actually completely hollowed out. And it's the most incredible workmanship. And quite how it was done, who knows? But they are extraordinarily light and delicate creations, and really rather wonderful. And they didn't originally have the little Chinese figures sitting cross-legged on the top rail. Those were added about 2 or 3 years after they were made, and presumably the prince just sort of thought things weren't quite Chinese enough in his Chinese drawing room. And then on the right is Queen Alexandra's great state portrait by Sir Luke Fields in 1905, hanging above the sofa from Brighton with a gilded carved wood frame in the form of bamboo. That open door is open into the centre room. It's now called the centre room. When it was first decorated, it was known as the Tapestry drawing room. But it is the central room and sits behind the balcony. Now here it is as it was first decorated, and this is as arranged again for that state visit of Napoleon III and Eugénie in 1855. And you can see here on the end wall those huge gilt carved wood swags, festoons, sort of Grinling Gibbon style, are the ones that are now in the marble hall downstairs that we saw in the last programme. And so those at that time were on the wall in here, what was then the Tapestry drawing room, and it was known as the Tapestry drawing room because of the tapestries framed on the wall on the right there. And then all of this furniture is actually the Hervé chairs, and there are sofas also. And it's hard to recognize them in this picture, but you can just see the little Chinese figures sitting on top of the top rails. Then that massive sofa under the tapestry, that's also from Brighton. That's now sitting in the principal corridor. Most of the objects in this room were from the music room in the Brighton Pavilion. So the pagodas, those huge standing lamps, those were oil lamps originally, on the left, and the chandelier, which is oil-painted glass. Those all came from the music room in Brighton. Here is the balcony, as it was built by Edward Blore, and here it's shown in 1893 at the wedding of May of Cambridge and George of Wales, who of course would become King George V and Queen Mary. And seated on the balcony, you can just see her tiny head poking up over the balustrade in the centre. There is Queen Victoria, and she's seated, and everybody else, of course, is standing. And they're watching the new Duke and Duchess of York driving away after their wedding. And so here is the room when it's first called the centre room, because the tapestries have gone, and it is the central room. And here it's been redecorated for King Edward VII in his usual white and gold. And here he has hung it here with portraits of 3 emperors. And so on the left we have Tsar Alexander I by his English sort of court painter, George Dore, painted in 1824. And this has been bought by Queen Victoria from her mother's chaplain. And then in the centre is Tsar Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, who was married to Edward VII's niece, Alix of Hesse. And he's dressed in a British uniform as Colonel of the Royal Scots Greys. And the portrait was given to King Edward VII at Reval in 1908. An enormous, rather vigorously carved frame on the right is around a portrait of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, and he's dressed as Colonel of the King's Dragoon Guards, another British regiment. And that portrait was given to Edward VII in 1902 for his coronation. Now here's a detail again of the Saloon at Brighton. This I'm showing you because it shows the full extent of the depredations of the building that happened before it was sold to the Corporation of Brighton. And the Crown had originally imagined that the corporation were going to pull the building down and build some housing on the spot. And I think they didn't even bother to ask, really, what the corporation's plan was. And so they removed all of the fittings from the building. So not only the fireplaces and, the doors, but actually the woodwork. And so here, the carved gilt wood mouldings that surrounded the pleated silk panels in the walls of the saloon those were removed, and they actually are part of the decoration of the centre room. You can't see it very clearly in this photograph, but those are used in the cornice of the room and on the mirror frames. And here is the centre room as redecorated by Queen Mary. And so all of the woodwork really has remained in place. But because of the Chinese character of it and these Chinese-inspired fireplaces in there, and of course all of the Chinese drawing room furniture by Hervé, Queen Mary rather reasonably thought, let's go all the way and make it really Chinese. And she also happened on a bundle of old imperial yellow silk hangings that were sort of packaged up in the stores of Buckingham Palace with a note saying that they had been a gift from the Emperor of China in 1897. And they had clearly just been put to one side and never thought about. And Queen Mary loved these sort of things, and so she got them out and had them hung in the panels on the walls in here, and they fitted rather beautifully, as you can see. And she then found a whole lot of other silk embroideries and things and recovered the furniture in those. And the walls were painted pale celadon green. Now the room's recently been redecorated, and the imperial yellow silk hangings, you can see one of them remains on the left here, and it's no longer imperial yellow, it's rather faded. But the walls instead have been painted now a sort of imperial yellow, and then with this very strong turquoise dado below, and it looks rather marvellous. And here you can see this incredible fireplace, and the paintings on the walls and the sideboards indeed all come from the banqueting room in the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. The paintings in this room, there were 8 in all of this size that were taken, and only 4 of them were used by Queen Victoria, and these 4 I think were in storage until it was realized that actually they would fit rather perfectly in here. But it is always an extraordinary surprise for people to realize that behind that rather staid-looking, very sober, very classical balcony on the front of Buckingham Palace, which the royal family appear on all great occasions, is this incredible sort of burst of colour and fantasy with all these Chinese characters and these gilded dragons. And as a child, I used to go to that room every year for a quick drink after the Trooping the Colour, the Queen's birthday parade, which I was lucky enough to be allowed to watch because my grandfather would ride in it behind the Queen. And so I would gape at all of these extraordinary details in the room. And my father would always explain to me, oh, they're from Brighton. I never really understood what he meant, but years later I discovered. Now here on the left, more of these amazing mouldings from Brighton, and the doors from the Saloon. And some of the doors were put back there afterwards, but these ones were used here. And of course they're made in England, and it's a very English interpretation of chinoiserie, and rather beautifully done in these different colours of gold. And then here, the open central doors out onto the balcony, and with the Queen Victoria Memorial. And on the right, you can see some of the curtains put together for Queen Mary using these old Chinese embroideries, which again were found in bales in the stores and were probably things that had been used by the Prince of Wales in the 1790s, and then he'd got bored of them and had them taken off, and they've been carefully preserved all those years, as Queen Mary made great use of them. Here are the helmets of the curtains, and you can see another of these curtain poles from Brighton, and then the helmet itself with all of these cut-up, embroidered Chinese motifs. And in the foreground is the glass pearl-edged painted glass chandelier. And here on the left, a Chinese vase with wonderful gilt bronze dragon mounts made by Pavillion in 1807. And then on the right, you can see one of these giant oil lamps from the music room in Brighton. And they've been made using these Chinese export vases, which are the sort of the middle bit. And those have been made in 1720. And some of them have the coat of arms of the Duc d'Orléans. Those are actually Chinese export goods commissioned by a member of the French royal family, taken to Paris, and then bought in Paris by some agent of the Prince Regent 80 years later, and then reconfigured, and the bases are all made by Spode, along with the bowl at the top, and then all the gilt bronze made by Vuillaume. And they are absolutely the most extraordinary objects, and probably some of the most elaborate light fittings ever made. And here on the left, one of the matching fireplaces, and similarly to the one in the yellow drawing room, they have these painted bronze figures of Chinese characters, although these ones don't have any colour, they're just partially gilded bronze. And look at that dragon holding the fire irons, isn't he wonderful? And then on the right, a detail of one of those standing lamps. And then here, a couple of candelabra made for the Chinese drawing room in Carlton House in 1790 by Daguerre, with these wonderful Chinese figures. They're incredibly intricately painted. I think those are just beautiful. And did you love the little bells hanging from the frame of the one on the right? And here the clock that was made ensuite with those candelabra. And then it's had this rather odd-looking gilt bronze cushion added below it for it to sit on. That was added in 1811 when the Chinese drawing room was dismantled, and all of this was moved to the bow room upstairs in Carlton House. And the Prince Regent was constantly adding things to things. And this actually has 3 steps of white marble as an extra plinth that are at the moment in storage, probably because they don't fit on that fireplace. But to be honest, I don't know that the cushion really helps, do you? I think it looks rather better without it. And then on the right, a detail of one of the figures on the fireplace. And then on the opposite fireplace stands this French clock in white marble and gilt bronze, and this was made about 1780 by David Frédéric Dubois, and this was bought by the Queen in 1977, rather aptly because it had belonged to Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, who was George IV's brother and Queen Mary's grandfather. This clock has really come home, as it were. And on the right, something else of Queen Mary's. This is her bell push. And when I was photographing the room, someone called the Master of the Household, who is in charge of the palace, came in and asked me how I was getting on. And he pointed out to me this bell push that I had never noticed, because it is absolutely tiny. And it's this tiny little sort of Chinese devil mask sitting inside one of the mouldings on one of the panels. And in the old days, of course, you could press down on the red lacquered tongue and the footman would appear. And here is the north end of the principal corridor. The centre room, of course, opens off the centre of the corridor. And here we have this pair of marvellous sofas from the Pavilion in Brighton. Here is Queen Mary, looking completely splendid, standing on a balcony with her garter robes draped over the balustrade behind her. And she's holding a Chinese fan that had belonged to Queen Victoria. So really everything ties in together here in Queen Victoria's principal corridor, surrounded by all of these Chinese objects that were arranged here by Queen Mary, who had an absolute passion for all things Chinese. And so here is the pair of that Weissweiler cabinet that we saw on the other end of the corridor. And on the right, on it, is one of these extraordinary gilt bronze and hardstone bonsai trees in enamelled jardinière. And there's a whole collection of these that were, of course, bought by the Prince Regent and used to decorate the corridor at Brighton. I think these are absolutely incredible objects. I love them. And then on the right, above one of those Brighton sofas, is just a corner of the great painting by William Frith of the wedding of the then Prince of Wales to Alexandra of Denmark. So that's Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, who got married in Windsor in 1863. And Frith was a great favourite artist of Queen Victoria, who loved his densely populated, very animated scenes of Derby Day and all those sorts of paintings. And so she commissioned him to do this enormous picture, which drove him nearly nuts, and it took 2 years, and because he had to include absolute photographic likenesses of all of the principal personages. In kilts, you can see Princes Leopold and Arthur, the younger sons of Queen Victoria, and then the lady with the enormous purple train in the foreground, that is Vicky, the Princess of Prussia, Queen Victoria's daughter, who would become Empress Frederick III very briefly. Now here's the last room that we are going to see, and this is, to my mind, the best. And this is the Chinese luncheon room. Here you can see it painted in watercolour by James Roberts, soon after the 10th of June 1849, which is when Queen Victoria wrote in her diary that she had breakfasted in there for the first time and eaten dinner there the night before. This room was entirely made of pieces from the music room and the banqueting room in Brighton, and it was referred to as the Pavilion breakfast room for a few years. And so here you can see the fireplace, this enormous, extraordinary fireplace, and the chandelier, and indeed the carpet all come from the music room at Brighton. And that was an enormous carpet, and so only the central section was used to cover this floor. And then the doors and frames, the overframes above the doors, and the paintings on the wall come from the banqueting room, and the paintings being similar to the ones that are now in the centre room. Now here on the left is the music room at Brighton, with the fireplace in situ there, and the Prince Regent in situ on the left, flanked by a couple of lady friends enjoying a concert. And on the right, the banqueting room in the middle of a great luncheon being given. And so here you can see those doors and frames in the background, and 2 of the paintings that are now in this room. And so here, 1873, we see the room arranged exactly the same way. And still today, pretty much unchanged. The ceiling has changed colour somewhat, and then the walls have been painted a rather stronger turquoise than they were before. And also the curtains redone by Queen Mary, and the carpet, of course, has been changed several times. But otherwise, it is exactly the same. I rather love the ceiling with the dragon and snake fighting to the death, holding up this chandelier from Brighton. And then here is that incredible fireplace, designed by Robert Jones and then carved by Richard Westmacott. And the whole of the top, including that enormous dragon, was carved from one single block of white marble. And the rock clock that sits on top of it, that was made in Paris around 1750. And it was probably bought by Vuillamy in Paris for the music room. It was delivered by him in 1819, and it has Chinese figures on it and a dragon. So the whole thing blends in marvellously, especially with the gilt bronze colonnettes that Jones has worked into his design. And this was the one fireplace from Brighton that was deemed worthy of having a special grate made. And so these Chinese landscape scenes must have been done in about 1848 to fit it in here. And Prince Albert got terribly cross with Edward Blore, the architect, who had failed to measure the fireplace surrounds from Brighton and failed to provide hearths that were big enough. And then here we're looking through one of the open windows at the Victoria Memorial on the left there. When I took the photograph, the band of the Household Division were playing in the forecourt down below for the changing of the guard, which made it rather marvellous. And here are 2 more of those enormous oil lamps from Brighton, and on the right a detail of the curtain pelmet made for Queen Mary, using those old Chinese embroideries that she found in store. Here on the left, another of Robert Jones's wonderful paintings, and the man who designed the room at Brighton also did the paintings, and they are really rather beautiful. and below 2 of the chairs from that set made for the banqueting room at Brighton. And on the right, one of the sideboards made by Bailey and Saunders for that same room, using rosewood, snakewood, and satinwood. What snakewood is, I don't know, but you couldn't find a more suitable timber for this interior, really, could you? And then you see that painted dado has been copied exactly from the one in Brighton. Now, this is the last picture of all and just shows that extraordinary dragon. Ferocious, isn't it? Carved by Westmacott from a single block of marble, and the rock clock on top, and just the heart of the extraordinary fantasy that is these Chinese rooms.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed seeing something of the interiors of Buckingham Palace with me, and if you're interested, do buy the book. Available from all good booksellers. All my photographs and my words, most of them vaguely accurate. Thank you for watching.